Good morning, friends. It's yet another beautiful day in Atlanta, and from Shay Cricket from Story Muse Central, I'm so pleased today to be talking to Chetter Galloway, one of my favorite humans. I know I say that about everybody, but honestly, I wouldn't do one of these conversations with somebody if I didn't like talking to them. Today, I'm having a delicious tea, also known as coffee. I'm doing a workshop this afternoon at a local university, and so I needed a little extra pep in my step. Um, as I mentioned, our conversation today is with Chetter Galloway. He is a local storyteller. He comes to Carapace, the storytelling show that I produce. He's also a member of Kuumba, and we're going to get him to tell us what Kuumba is. And he's a fellow Virginia Tech alumni. Chetter, are you there at the virtual door? Knock, knock, knock. Chetter, hello.
Hello. Whoop.
Oh,
Hello.
welcome, Chetter.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Wouldn't have missed it for the world.
Oh, I've been in love with you for so long. It's such a fun thing to have you come and talk to us about storytelling. So welcome. Will you tell folks a little bit about you? I want to let's start with you were born in a van down by the river. No, tell us where were you born and where did you grow up?
Okay, sir. Well, I grew up in the DMV, the Old Dominion, also known as Virginia, place called Suffolk, Virginia, which is the
Mhm.
largest city in Virginia land-wise. You probably didn't know that because
Well,
we're
I
not.
did, but that's because I'm from Virginia.
See, most people don't because we're not bound by any county lines, and we're just sort of spread out. And I grew up hearing my dad tell stories on Sunday road trips. We had a great big limousine known as a 1972 Fleetwood Cadillac, where I would sit in the back seat between my two sisters, listening to him tell us stories. Long before child safety laws, I would sit on the armrest and play a game. How far forward am I going to go when my dad hits the brakes? Am I going to go off the seat to the back seat, or my goal was to go clean to the windshield, but not through it?
Well, if you're listening in, then you could tell that Cheddar is the consummate storyteller. Anytime you're having a conversation with him, you feel like you're already entering into one of his epic tales, which is one of my favorite things about you. So, Cheddar, the reason why I'm having these conversations with people is they're public research that I'm doing
Mhm.
about a storytelling show, and it's about my quest for identity and purpose through all of the endless string of crappy jobs that I had in my early 20s. The show is going to be called I'm a Little Teapot. That's why these are called Tea and Jam with Me. And I'm curious, did you always know that you were a storyteller? At what point did you start to embrace the storyteller in you?
Okay. Well, it was probably right after college. I graduated from Virginia Tech, of course, with a degree in history, and I was expecting this huge six-figure salary to follow it. Things didn't quite work out that way, and I found myself working at Colonial Williamsburg, sharing the stories of both the enslaved and free African Americans during that time period. And it was there where I saw interpreters using storytelling to engage visitors and address serious topics and troubling situations and times. And I picked up my first story there at Colonial Williamsburg and developed a knack for it and continued over the years developing African American stories primarily for many years before moving over to more personal narrative type storytelling later on in life. But
Hold
historical
on a
museums
second. I don't know
describe.
if it's my internet or yours, but we're having a little bit of a rough connection there. Um, so I just want to make sure I understand this was like kind of like a first job out of college that summer, and you just like stumbled backwards into this opportunity that you found yourself really good at. Like, how often does that happen for people?
Right. Yeah. And yes, that's exactly
Oh
how
no,
it
Cheddar.
happened. Can you hear?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Oh, okay. It's like getting a little wonky and frozen. So that was like literally your first job, Colonial Williamsburg, right out of college?
Colonial Williamsburg, well, Jamestown settlement first. Colonial
Mhm.
Williamsburg is where things started taking off. Actually, I was working at both of them simultaneously at the same time. So I was getting the best of both worlds from telling stories from sharing stories about people who lived in two different centuries. So it was a good starting point and good foundation for telling. And many of the people I met at Colonial Williamsburg, I still stay in touch with, via social media nowadays.
Wow. I mean, how lucky is that to just like find yourself right out of college having this experience and saying, I'm really good at this. I mean, I hear what you're saying, like you weren't like getting paid mad big bucks doing that, but that you knew that it was something that was kind of a rarefied skill that you were good at. And so where did you take it from there? What happened when you were doing that?
Well, for a while at Colonial Williamsburg, I was filling the place of someone who had been deployed overseas in the military. And during that time, I was looking for a full-time job, and an opportunity popped up in South Carolina at a place called Historic Bradensville, where I'd be sharing similar type stories. And as soon as I saw the bulletin on the bulletin board, I promptly snatched it down so no one else would see it. Because you see a job and you're like, this is mine. I know this is mine. I know it is. So I filled out the application for it, and got an interview. Side note, this is my on my way down there. They just happened to be a basketball game, and I'm a basketball fan. It was my first time going to a professional basketball game, the Charlotte Hornets and the New York Knicks. So that's one of the things I remember about the interview down there. And I said, this is going to be a good interview. So things turned out well, and I stayed there for 2.5 years. And in fact, one of the programs I started is still ongoing to this day.
You started a program there?
Um, it was a program called By the Sweat of Our Brow, and it was dealt with the life that the enslaved Africans were dealing with on that particular location at that historic site. And each year they bring in descendants of those folks who worked there at historic Bradensville, and they do research, they talk about history, they talk about life ways, and do different things to recognize their contributions.
Wow. That must feel so good to know that you've made this lasting impact through your story work.
It does. It really does, because for so many years, and even to this day, nowadays, some of those stories are frowned upon, or people have difficulty sharing or listening to them.
Mm.
However, we know they made an impact that and paved the path for us today, that we still need to share their lives and their stories.
Yeah, I know that that is a complicated thing. Like we're in this moment where like paying attention to or turning away from our real history is complicated. It's become very political. Like what's your personal philosophy on telling the truth about our history?
What's that old saying or adage? If you don't tell your story, your history, you're doomed to repeat it. It fails me at the moment, but you have to share the stories in order not to repeat them, learn from them, and grow from it. Understand you're in a different time period than what they were. Their perspective is going to be a little different than yours. And just think back to their time period. 200 years before them, they couldn't believe what people were going through and what they had experienced. So in that way, history is repetitive, but we have to take the time frame into consideration when we're sharing and restating their stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So am I hearing that there are not just folks that want to erase that history because they don't want to they don't want to hear about it because from a white narrative perspective, but that there are folks of color who don't want to hear those stories because they feel like there's a dark power in having those stories spoken out loud?
For many years, and I know I experienced this when I started at historic Bradsville in South Carolina. There was still some tension amongst the communities and some issues of not wanting to hear this or not wanting to relive that path, because that past, P-A-S-T, I should say, because it was considered something they didn't want to deal with and just wanted to leave the past in the past and not talk about slavery at all. I recall while working at Colonial Williamsburg, an incident that made the newspaper and national news, as a matter of fact. It was 1994. Wow, I'm dating myself. The historic Colonial Williamsburg was going to reenact an estate sale. However, the press picked it up as Colonial Williamsburg sells slaves, and yes. And wow. That, yes, it was picked up in that manner and sensationalized, when what the group was trying to do is show how, people were separated from their families, and how in one situation, a gentleman who was a freed man, a free Black man, went to the estate sale to get his wife back from his former owner. So those are the types of stories that they were trying to share. Unfortunately, it was picked up, by the press and blown out. It was social mediaized, I like to call it, before social media was around.
Yeah. So I want to fast forward a little bit in time. I don't know how much we're fast forwarding, but you got to go to the ETSU storytelling master's program, which is another place I'm from. It's, I grew up, I said I'm from Virginia, but that's actually where I chose to live as a young adult. But I grew up very near ETSU. At what point did you go through that program, and what was that like? And what did you learn from that process?
Okay. Well, I had moved to Atlanta in '97 and stayed here for about 6 years and went to ETSU. Let me just backtrack real quick. I left South Carolina and moved to Atlanta in '97 and stayed here 6 years after working at the Atlanta History Center and connecting with storytellers. And then I went to ETSU around almost about 20 years ago now. And that was a great experience because it exposed me to storytellers that I otherwise wouldn't have an opportunity to see live, because many times during the summer, they would bring in a national or international level storyteller to do a week-long, or maybe it was a few days long, storytelling institute. So you had a chance to sit at the feet of that person and learn and soak in all of their knowledge and gifts and talents, and see how you could apply what you've learned from them to your own storytelling. It was also a place where you could experience. I got exposed to a little acting with one of my classes called Storytelling for Actors, Acting for Storytelling. And one of our and one of our assignments was to come up with a stand-up comedy routine about yourself, which is quite interesting at that time, because you're going based off what you've lived up to that point. And it was interesting to come up with a piece. Actually, part of the piece I came up with, I've developed into a comedic story over the years. And classes like that were a great time to experience storytelling and learn about yourselves and how you express your story, your life through your stories. We also would go up to different schools for programs. We would we were the ETSU Storytelling Tale Tellers Troupe, and we would go out to different schools. And part of our assignment was to come up with an actual program of stories to share with different age groups, which is important because the same type of stories you tell kindergartners, you can't necessarily tell to 12th grade.
Right.
Then there's those stories that there's a sweet spot where some story fits across all age ranges, but there many times they're few and far in between. And it was a great experience also because that helped me when I got on the roster for young audiences. The story, some of the stories I learned back at ETSU, I was able to compile into a program that was part of their roster when I told stories there.
So, like I said, that's exactly where I grew up. And that's actually part of my origin story as a storyteller, is that I don't know how much the storytelling program at Tennessee existed at that time, but I know that the International Storytelling Center was nascent, and they were sending out storytellers to our schools. So we got to hear some of those, like Doc McConnell and some of those storytellers, and we even had a little storytelling club. So we got to tell stories back to those famous storytellers. And so, like, I always, when people ask me like how I became a storyteller, I talk about how I ignored my calling for so long. And like at 9 years old, I was like telling stories back to people like Doc McConnell, and like got to have him like play his banjo and be like, da 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 for me. But then it took me, 30 more years before I really started to pay attention to what felt like was there all along. That's such a wonderful experience. I'm really resonating too with what you're talking about in terms of the connections between theater and storytelling, but I've also thought about like, what are the differences? I'm wondering, do you have a philosophy, or have you thought because of that program about what is the line of difference or similarity between theater and storytelling?
The main difference I see is that in traditional hardcore theater, there is that fourth wall. There is no interaction or audience participation. They may ask of the audience, rhetorically, but they're not expecting a response back. In storytelling, if our entertainer asks for a response back, we don't want to be left hanging. Yeah. So that, and I see theater and other like songwriters or people who play instruments, primarily musicians, they'll incorporate storytelling into their sets. That's the main difference that I see between those two art forms. And while a storyteller can play an instrument and they can be a thespian, and incorporate elements of theater into their pieces, that's the primary hardcore difference I see in between the art forms. Theater's, that fourth wall.
Yeah, I always thought it was whether or not there was a script. That I always thought the storyteller had the freedom and flexibility to sort of, not just I agree about the, interaction with the audience, but I always thought it was about the freedom and flexibility to riff off of that interaction and change what you might say from night to night. But I do know that there are some storytellers that are pretty routine and rote about what they're saying.
I think they are with some of their signature pieces. And in that case, I understand you have to be. And if you're doing a first person of, say, someone like, I'll just say Arthur Ashe, for the first person that came to mind for me, you're telling his story from the perspective of theater, and you might want to incorporate the audience in as part of your presentation. That's a little different, and I can see that working. I see that working with a lot of tellers. However, like with traditional storytelling, yes, of course, you're going to change your words or your flow of speaking, or change the ending altogether, as necessary on the spot to best, so the audience will best receive it. Not to necessarily appease them, because there's a difference in doing that. However, so you could have practiced it one way, and then you get on stage, I'm going to try this. I know this is going to work better. And sure enough, that last minute switch is what makes the difference in that story.
Okay, great. I'm glad you brought up Arthur Ashe, because I think of the Arthur Ashe piece and the Alonzo Herndon piece as two of the seminal works that I know about from you. as these, Black luminary historical figures that you identified with in some way or wanted to lift up their history. So either way, I would love to talk to you about your, like, why you chose them, your process for developing those shows, and are you still performing them? Let's just like tell the audience about either of those pieces.
Okay, I'll go with Alonzo Herndon. I've told the story and performed it more often than anything else. For folks who are unaware, Alonzo Herndon was Atlanta's first Black millionaire. He was a former enslaved man from the big city of Social Circle, Georgia, which is out east on 20 between Covington and Augusta, or Madison and Covington, somewhere out there. He
Sorry,
was
the candle was so strong. It was smelling so strong. It was driving me crazy. I had to blow it. Sorry.
No worries. But he earned his just short version. He was former enslaved man. His father was his was his owner. His mother was one of the slaves, and he learned to be a barber, and earned his millions being a barber, real estate, and life insurance. Those were the three things he used to become a millionaire. He had a barbershop called the Crystal Palace, located at 66 Peachtree Street. 25 chairs, 20 baths, crystal chandeliers, marble floors, mahogany doors, everything you would expect to find in the finest barbershop like this, except one thing. People who looked like me couldn't get their hair cut there, because at that time, because of Jim Crow laws, Peachtree Street was for whites only. However, he did have other barbershops where Blacks would get their hair cut. Actually, during the 1906 Atlanta race riots, his barbershop was vandalized and one of his workers was killed during that turmoil. A lot of that had to do with many whites at the time thought that too many Blacks were being successful and being more prominent than they had expected. And the rumor started about the riot, not to get too off track here, was because a young black man had allegedly assaulted a white woman. And once that rumor spread, the mob grew, and they actually had to call in the National Guard to quell the violence. So in telling his story, that's right there is just one part of his story that you could I can share. His wife experienced racism as well. She was a thespian, and she was, I believe, part Creole, part French, and she wanted to act in Boston, but once they found out she was a person of color, she was no longer allowed to act, and wound up teaching at the Atlanta University Center. I think it was Atlanta University at the time, along with W.B. Du Bois. She taught elocution. Her name was Adrienne McNeil Herndon. The Herndon home. I can go on, so just stop me.
It's all fascinating. What was your research process like to develop that show?
Well, the Atlanta History Center, they have an exhibit about Alonzo Franklin Herndon during that time period of the early 1900s, and it covers a little bit of the 1906 race riots. And also the Herndon home is still around, as you can still tour it. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. There's a plethora of information there because that's the home that he and his wife built. An interesting story about that house: it took them approximately 2 years to build, and was considered, a big deal of a house at the time. However, unfortunately, she died pretty young at the age of 40 because she suffered from something called Addison's disease, and she was in a pain for a lot. So I think she stayed in the house maybe 3 months or 4, but didn't get to fully experience all the grandeur that she had developed and helped make. And the house was built with African-American artisans they wanted to make sure that was part of the building process of them building the house that they stayed in. So it's still there today, and you can visit. Um, just a fascinating story. One thing I find comical about it, he married her in 1893 on Halloween. That's one of the interesting little nuggets about their story, their love story. And they had one child, Norris, who died in 1977. Now think about it. That's not too long ago. 1977. They only had one child. And actually, one of the docents, I'm not sure if she's still with us, she shared a lot of this knowledge with me when I visited the house to do my research. She actually worked for Norris, the Herndon son. So that, that's just how close we are to the past or the previous generation. And I think that's just fascinating, because he was born in 1858. He died in 1926. He remarried in the 30s or 40s. I can't remember right off the top of my head. And his son just died in 1977. Yeah. And somebody knew him and touched him. That's just gives me chills. No, you're that close to the generation before you.
Yeah, yeah. So did you ever get to go perform the show at either the house or at the Atlanta History Center?
Well, at the Atlanta History Center, they had me in the exhibit as Mr. Herndon, telling stories and perform. They were bringing around groups every 10 or 15. I was doing a 10 to 15-minute set of his story. I did, for the National Storytelling Network, get an opportunity to do a one-man show on Herndon back in 2018. It was called Cuts, Trims, and Shaves, story of Atlanta's first Black millionaire.
I remember. I think we got to work a little bit together on that. I just wondered if you'd gotten to go back, since you got to do your research there, I wondered if you'd gotten to, take the story back there, since that, would have felt so full circle.
Yes, they did ask me at one time, actually during that time around 2018. However, as cliche as it sounds, life happens and we never reconnected. Haven't reconnected since then. But I have told the story on several occasions since then.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about the Arthur Ashe piece? Because I find that really fascinating too, especially because of the Virginia connection.
Yeah, yes. Arthur Ashe piece is a continued work in progress. I've shared his story at one of our programs with Kuumba called Historical Black Portraits once. And I always tell people, there is no way I can tell 49 years in 10 minutes. Ask yourself, whatever age you are, did you just live 10 minutes? Okay, then you shouldn't expect, even in an hour-long show, you can't tell that person's entire life. Arthur Ashe, I connect with for a number of reasons. Again, native Virginian. He also played tennis. I played tennis briefly at Virginia Tech, and I do want to stress briefly. And he was also very politically, well, I don't say politically active. He was socially active man during his time period. He after he left tennis, he became a spokesperson for the American Heart Association. He also not campaign, what's the word I'm looking for? When it was in the early 1990s, he protested the treatment of Haitians trying to enter the country, if my history serves me correct. And he unfortunately died from a blood transfusion when he contracted HIV. He only lived to be 49, which is young, but he was still very, very socially active, even after his tennis career was over. And I like his story because he came up during a time when tennis was a sport that wasn't really welcoming to African Americans. Both he and his contemporary would be Althea Gibson. I know from a friend of mine, one of his coaches or his coach was from someone in Lynchburg, Virginia. You know where Lynchburg is, of course.
Oh yeah, I do.
So
I think one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about both of those pieces, and I want to get into Kuumba, is because you are somebody who strikes me as really living in this space of telling stories that are so inextricably linked with identity in one way or another. And I feel like the show that I'm developing are about me sort of pitching myself forward blindly into trying to claim one identity after another, or not even claim, but like figure out identity through work. And not doing that very gracefully at all. But I love how you're exploring different facets of identity through these stories that you're helping to tell, that you are telling. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about what we learn about ourselves through the stories that we tell, or what your reflections are about the sense of identity.
Good question, in-depth question. What we learn about us, what I've learned about myself telling stories, is to embrace my flaws, be transparent, laugh at my stumbles and bumbles and fumbles. And I have a saying for myself. People take it as you may, if your heart is still beating after all of that, then you are doing just fine. Because we all have this roller coaster of a life. We're going to go up, may go climb up the hill slowly, then all of a sudden you're dropped down at this rapid rate. And how you recover from the next hill or the next helix or inversion defines you as a person. And that's going to happen throughout your life. And how you embrace that and recover from it, makes you stronger for the next obstacle that you're going to face coming along. And I think that I've learned more about myself now that I'm north of 50. And I enjoy sharing the stories, thinking about, well, hey, this has really helped make me the person who I am, and let me know to learn from that mistake, and maybe when I see a situation coming, know how to address it differently than I would have 20, 30 years ago. And share, you can develop a story from where you were 30 years ago, and how you reacted and how you react now, and what the difference is. I don't like using react because that sounds like you're on the defense, but how you address it, how you would address it then versus now, and what has changed and what was part of the process. What were the steps in the process of that change?
Yeah. Story that you tell about yourself when you're 20 is definitely going to be different every time you tell it, because you've changed. Like, you are different. Yeah. That's such a beautiful reflection. So tell us a little bit about Kuumba. What is that organization?
Okay, absolutely. Kuumba Storytellers of Georgia was founded in 1995. We are an affiliate of the National Association of Black Storytellers. Currently, I serve as president. And Kuumba means creativity, sixth principle from Kwanzaa. Kuumba, we started with 4 storytellers back in 95. Now our membership is hovering around 40. And over the years, people, of course, come and go, but we remain consistent. Our motto is we tell it well in the ATL. We tell it in libraries, museums, schools, anywhere someone has an opportunity and wants us to share stories, we do that. We also provide workshops, storytelling workshops twice a year, and story swaps, monthly story swaps. We offer them second Saturday of each month. Currently now, well, since the pandemic, we've been on Zoom because that seems to work, and we have we can reach people, worldwide. I was about to say nationwide, but worldwide, as the case may be. So we are puppeteers, we have actors, singers, storytellers, just the comedians, just a whole range of people who want to help us live our mission, which is to preserve the African oral tradition, provide cultural awareness on the history of African American people, and serve as a cultural resource for the community. Our most recent program on February 4th was Historical Black Portraits, where we had several members portray well-known to little-known or even unknown historical people from the past. And that was very, very well received in the community. Next year, in 2025, we will be co-hosting the National Association of Black Storytellers Festival and Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. We've hosted it on 2 other occasions, in 2007 as well as 2011. And we're looking forward to it because it coincides with our 30th year as an organization. So wow. And my Mike Tyson voice, I'm ecstatic. I'm ecstatic. I'm ecstatic about the opportunity, just totally ecstatic.
That's awesome. So are you sort of privately behind the scenes supporting each other in the development of material? Like, do you get together and coach each other and like work on when you're developing a new story? Are you a guild in that way?
Absolutely. There's no other way to get feedback, other than to try it blind on stage and be like, that didn't work. That didn't work, which can be a learning experience in and of itself. But not a fun one. But yes, we do get together and coach each other and get suggestions. We do that sometimes at our swaps or one-on-one, or specifically for some of the programs that we do, like the one most recently a couple of weeks ago. So yes, that's essential to get that kind of feedback and critique.
I'm really envying having a group of colleagues in that way. I feel like we are lacking that in the personal storytelling field, and that sense of camaraderie and support, because I feel like I'm just still trying to figure out how to do that as I develop this show. Maybe I could call on you, but I feel really lost and awash in how to develop my first, well, not my completely first long form piece, but it's been a while, and I'm sort of that's why I'm having these conversations, is that I want to get back to figuring out how. So whether it's a historical piece or a personal one, what is your process for breaking down and developing a long form show?
Okay. I try to tell a long form in different parts, like let's say every 15 minutes or every 10 minutes is a standalone story. However, it connects to the next one. It could end there, but it's sort of like a unspoken cliffhanger. Wow. And that way, you're not learning a whole long story for an entire hour, which, some folks do, and, to each his own, as they say. However, I like breaking it up so that I can jump into part 3 of 5, and it's a standalone. Then I need to go back to part 1 just to see how well I know it. Then from part 1, I'm going to part 4, then back to part 2. Then I'm going to wrap it up in part 5. And that way, I'll get all the information I need, and I can get familiar with it enough, and I don't have to learn it linearly, and if one piece is out of order, I'm all out of whack. Part of my technique too is to just either visually record something and look at it, or in this age of technology, we have so much technology at our hand, just record into my iPhone and listen to it and see what works. what works for me, what works best in that piece. I'm sort of in the same way. I'm in the same situation as well. I'm considering I want to develop a long form show, personal show, a different one. And I'm thinking about bringing on an actual director, producer, because self-produce it myself, I think someone else will look at it differently than me. And you need that, and maybe not even a set of familiar eyes, a set of eyes that you aren't familiar to, or a voice you haven't heard, and that might work best for what you're presenting, because they'll be more objective, and they don't know you as well when you're doing that particular piece.
Yeah. Well, at the very least, maybe we should trade some coaching with each other as we're developing our pieces.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The 4 tenets of my project are purpose, possibility, power, and passion. And it sounds like, because you were able to get so quickly into storytelling, you haven't really had a lot of, I mean, I know you have like worky work that supports your storytelling work, but actually I do know that. So that's kind of one of the things that I am exploring, is like the other kind of workaday work. Mm-hmm. So when you hear these words, purpose, possibility, power, passion, I want to just like randomly, I'm gonna choose power. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a story about power? Does that bring to mind a story for you?
Yes, actually it does.
Nice.
How long? A 5-minute story?
Yeah, let's do 5 minutes.
Okay, this is one of my favorite stories. It's a folk tale. I just told it at a swap on Saturday, so it's fresh.
Nice.
Okay, here goes. Like many of us who get together for coffee, breakfast, brunch, lunch, and tea, see how I twisted that in there? Jackal and Dog did the same thing. They got together for their morning walk and talk or chat amongst friends. Well, on this particular morning, as they were walking along, all of a sudden, Dog broke out in laughter. And he says, "My friend Jackal, it's so sad for you." And Jackal said, "What do you mean? Why so sad?" He says, "Well, I wouldn't want to do what you have to do for food. You see, the man feeds me whatever I want." And Jackal says, "Well, what do you mean the man feeds you?" He says, "Well, he loves me. He adores me. He even calls me man's best friend. And if you don't believe me, come to the village tonight. Watch, wait, and listen, and you'll see what I say is true." So Jackal just grunted, and they kept walking along until they went their separate ways. Dog went back to the village, and Jackal went to work, because he indeed have to get food, because they had to feed his family. And if he didn't get food, they would starve. So, and would have to sometimes rely on vines and roots and leaves. But on this day, he was very fortunate, because using his stealth and his skill, he caught a gazelle. And he took that gazelle home, and they chop, butchered it up, put it in a pot. They cleaned it. They ate to their heart's content. And everyone in Jackal's family fell asleep. But Jackal was still thinking about what the dog said, wondering if there was an easier way to get food. What if there was an easier way to get accessibility to things to eat? And wonder if what the dog said was true. So he left his house under the cover of darkness and went back to the village, and stayed at the edge, where he watched, he looked, and he listened. And that's when he heard the dog barking. Yup, 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 yup. And as the dog barked, one of the men came out, boom, threw the bone. And the dog gnawed on the bone. And then he barked again. Yup, 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 yup. The men came out, threw him some scraps, and he ate them up. He barked a third time. Yup, 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 yup. And the men threw him out some more food, some vegetables. Then he barked a fourth time, but this time he continued barking and running around and running around and running around the village. And on one of his trips around the village, he knocked over a bucket of milk. that the men had caught that day, that they'd gotten that day from one of the animals. And when the men saw that, they were furious with the dog. And one of them went over to him and kicked him out of the village. The dog went flying, woo, and rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled until he rolled onto the feet of his friend, the jackal, standing at the edge of the village. And as he sat there whimpering, Jackal looked down and says, "My friend, it's so sad for you. I may have to hunt for my food, but no one kicks me. So ask yourself, would you rather be the dog, barking and making a commotion and chilling and letting the man give you food? Or would you rather be the jackal, having the freedom, the power to do what you want?" And that's the end of that. And we would tell that story. I learned that story, I should say, from a historical interpreter at Colonial Williamsburg. And we would share it to address the issue of, would you rather remain enslaved or, again, have the power to be free?
I think there's some really interesting metaphors there about our modern workaday life too. I was thinking about that because I was on somebody else's podcast yesterday, and he was really sort of going in on like the choice to stay in work versus going out on your own, and why it took me so long to do that. And it was really hard, to make that choice. I think it's the whole thing about stability and health insurance and the 401k and all of that versus taking the risk and, being responsible for making all those things come in the door is a lot, What a powerful story about power, Chetter.
I told you it's my favorite, and that's one of those stories that I think that you can tell it across age brackets. People will get it. There's also another version of that story. It involves the wolf and the hound. I can't think of the animals, but you know how stories travel. So yeah. There's a different version of that story, as we learned in ETSU, with the same motif.
Yeah, I once heard that there's some version of the Cinderella story like that. It's not necessarily called Cinderella, but some, footprint of that trope in every continent, their, culture.
Oh yeah,
that was
because a story to one of the co-founders of the National Association of Black Storytellers, Mother Mary Carter Smith, she had a version of Cinderella called Cinderella. And instead of Cinderella getting in a pumpkin, Cinderella got in a Cadillac. I was working with a group of people in Clarkston from Sudan, and they had a version of Little Red Riding Hood, but it was called Mr. Hyena instead. And the guy didn't want to tell the story because his English wasn't that good, even though he spoke 5 other languages. So as somebody was translating it, I was thinking, I've heard this story before. I know I have heard this story. And by the time he got to the ending is a little different. But I was like, yeah, that's Little Red Riding Hood with the hyena. So it's just amazing when that, and I love sharing that little nugget of, because when people say, I don't speak English well, I don't speak this English well, but you speak 15 others. and here comes this beautiful story out of all of that. So I
think one of the things I really get lost in is how storytelling has such a profound power to transmit our values. And sometimes we have to pay attention to what values we're transmitting.
Agree.
Yeah. So another thing I like to do with people is I have this random dice generator on my screen. And if you will tell me when to stop.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Dice randomizer is no longer a go.
58. Tell us a story about yourself at the age of 58.
Ooh, oh man. Well, I am almost knocking on the triple 20, and I'm considering how I'm going to plan my excursion at triple 20. Now, 58 is fine. However, I'm a forward thinker. I'm a visionary. So I need to round up to 60 and see how life is going to be. But in the meantime, at 58, I'm considering I may be living in a 55 and up facility, which actually isn't a bad idea. I know it has a perception, but being 58 is a time you're almost 60. You've settled into yourself. Of course, you probably have more years behind you than you do in front of you. But I think in terms of stories, I'll have my at least one man show on the road touring. I'll have traveled back to Africa, Ghana specifically, to study drumming again and learn more stories, and living probably, maybe out west somewhere. That's my story for now. ... to be continued.
I love it. That's wonderful. Have you yet set your sights on another historical figure you'd like to develop a show about?
Actually, funny you should mention Herndon and Arthur Ashe. I was the last person not develop a full show around, but he was going to be part of a trifecta. Hank Aaron, Arthur Ashe. Oh, I didn't mention him earlier. And actually, Jesse Owens. I just happened to have his cup. Well, I went for a run this morning, so I'm running inspired. But those three, because they were athletes, and I see myself interchanging. Maybe this will be the piece at 58. I see myself interchanging. Who was first? It would be Jesse. I think that was first. Then Hank Aaron. Then Arthur Ashe. I think in terms of age, but they were maybe born about the same time. But each of them I can connect with in terms of doing a historical piece. Jesse Owens has a boatload of information of being of history. I actually had a chance to go to his museum that they have for him in Alabama last year, because I actually did a portrayal of him at our program last year, a 10-minute piece, and learned so much about him that isn't in the history book, so that you don't hear about Jesse Owens. Like, for example, his name technically is not Jesse. It's James Cleveland Owens, but he's from Alabama. When he moved to Ohio, the teacher heard when he said that his nickname was JC, he said JC, they thought he said Jesse. So and that's how he got named Jesse Owens. Those are little nuggets. He and I are born in September. Go Virgos. And he actually was part owner, I think, at a baseball team in Portland, Oregon. So he had a lot of odd jobs after his Olympic days were over. But those are the three I want to do as a one-man show at some point in life, because each of them had confronted their own part of their own phase of racism in their sports. Like, for example, Hank Aaron, in one of the stories I heard from, I read about him, said he was at in Washington, D.C., and they were breaking the dishes that the Black players had eaten off of rather than wash them and use them again. So, and of course, people intentionally trying to hit you pitchers intentionally trying to hit you as they're throwing at you. That goes without saying. But those three, I can definitely see a strong show, and that's one of those pieces I want someone outside to help direct and produce, because their descendants and people who knew them well are still around. You definitely don't want to disparage their names with a poor performance.
Yeah. I think I forget you're such a sports person. Were you happy with the Super Bowl? I know I saw you said something about how all of Atlanta showed up on the halftime show.
Well, actually, I was it was okay. I knew it was going to be a good game. I was hoping Baltimore and Detroit were going to be in there, because Detroit's never been. Lamar Jackson, they keeps getting these awesome records, MVPs, and they just can't seem to get to the Super Bowl. So I was looking forward to either one or both of them being in the Super Bowl. I knew this was going to be a good game, and it didn't disappoint. The halftime going to overtime, so it was a good game to watch. Sad football is over now, so I'm going to have a bit of a depression.
Well, but basketball is coming soon, and that is the longest sport of all of the seasons.
Right. Well, we're March Madness is going to start soon, and that means I need to start doing my brackets again.
So let's talk real quick about running. I had Sarah Beth on last month, and Sarah Beth, your fellow storyteller / runner.
Yes.
And she's gotten really into listening to things while she runs. Do you listen to stories while you run?
Now, oddly enough, once in a blue moon, I'll listen to stories. Music goes without saying. Usually big symphony orchestra. And there you can select that on Spotify, whatever your listening choice is, and use that for running. However, when I am running, I am working through stories or working through a transition. Why can't I get from point A to point B in this story? And hopefully, by the time I'm finished running, I've worked that out. Those are usually the long runs. I go like 8 to 10 miles. I'll try to figure out a story that I'm working on, because right after you finish running, you're filled with all this adrenaline, energy, and creativity to make a story and determine how you want to work it out so that it's performable. But yeah, that's my process while I'm working on a story or working on a transit or working on something I need to fix. It might be the ending of the story, so it doesn't fall flat, as the case was a couple of months ago. So
I feel like you and Sarah Beth could do a panel, or maybe I'll have you on together sometime so you can talk about your philosophies about running and storytelling and what the connections are there between.
Yeah, very very positive connection with stories.
Well, I can't believe we filled up a whole hour. I mean, I can, because you're one of the most fascinating humans on the planet. I'm so delighted to have a chance to get to know you just a little bit better. I look forward to more conversations. We'll have to go on one of our legendary walk and talks on the Beltline soon. And so pleased to help, more people get to know you better as well. Chetter, I think you're the bee's knees, and I will hope to see you at Carapace again soon.
Absolutely.
In the meantime, thanks to those of you who are tuned in. We'll see you for another tea and jam with me soon. And